Welcome back to our podcast. I'm the Disturbed Southern Belle.
And I'm the gentleman.
We're going to be finishing up with our last two episodes talking about some of the most horrific human experimentation throughout history. This week, we're going to be talking about one that's a little different. I mean, there was definitely human experimentation that went on, but there's also some other things that went on. But we're going to be talking about the Canadian Indian residential school system. So, the school system was this network of boarding schools that was for the Indigenous children of Canada. That would be like the Inuit people, for instance, like our American Indians, so to speak. This network of schools was funded by the Canadian government's Department of Indian Affairs, and it was essentially ran by these various Christian churches. So, yeah, that kind of tells you right there that it's going to be not like a normal school in most cases.
Yeah.
And back in those days especially. So it was set up in the hopes of isolating these Indigenous children from their culture and their religion, and they also hoped to influence the children in this like Euro-Canadian culture, and they often would locate these schools like far away from the kids' houses and their home communities so as to further limit their contact with their families and other Indigenous adults. So they would basically come in, just take them, put them in these schools that were like 100 miles away from home. And what nothing anybody could do about it, basically. So there were approximately 150,000 children that were placed in these schools over the course of the roughly 160-year history that it went on. They ran from around 1876 all the way up to 1997.
It's a fairly good time.
It is. So, as expected, the removal and isolation of the children caused many children to be harmed not only psychologically, but also physically, as they were often subjected to physical abuse in pretty much any manner you can think of. So, SA as well. Many were malnourished, and they were also exposed to numerous diseases. So, the number of school-related deaths is not commonly known, as many of the records are incomplete, but estimates believe it was somewhere between approximately 3,000 and possibly as high as 30,000 children died for different reasons while at these schools. Some, it might have been just something they got, and there was really nothing that could have been done, but some, probably they were more or less killed, probably, in some ways. So, starting in 2008, apologies from both politicians and religious groups for their roles in the school system were made. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was established to uncover the truths about the schools, which included a 2015 report that labeled the system as cultural genocide, which I see. Because they were pretty much trying to wipe out their culture. They were literally trying to make them white people, basically. That's what they were trying to do at that time, like European white people. That was what it was predominantly was. And there's nothing wrong with that if that's what they wanted to do, but they're just forcing them. So,
pretty much, yeah.
I think anybody should be able to act or be whatever they want, but you don't just make somebody do that, especially kids. It's sickening. The Pope even acknowledged that the system was genocide in 2022, as well as the House of Commons called the recognition of the residential school system as genocide in October of 2022 as well. As stated earlier, various churches ran the school of approximately 44 schools. Now, there was up to 80 at one point, but roughly running, there was around this many. Of those, there were 16 that were operated by the Catholic diocese, and about 36 Catholic communities operated 16 of them. 21 were operated by the Church of England, the Anglican Church of Canada. 13 were operated by the United Church of Canada, and 2 were operated by the Presbyterians. Now, the government was supposed to provide facilities and maintenance of where the children were supposed to be placed, while the churches were supposed to provide teachers and the lesson planning and all that. So all the inside stuff. So by the 1930s, government officials began to recognize that the system was, financially unsustainable, and it was also failing to meet the intended goal, which was supposed to be training and assimilating the children into the Euro-Canadian society. So basically trying to turn them into Euro-Canadian, children, basically.
Yeah.
So, Superintendent of Welfare and Training in the Indian Affairs Branch of the Federal Department of Mines and Resources, Robert Hoy, opposed the expansion of new schools, noting in 1936 that to build educational institutions, particularly residential schools, while the money at our disposal is insufficient to keep the schools already erected in a proper state of repair, is to me very unsound and a practice difficult to justify, which makes sense. He's basically saying we can't even take care of the ones we've got. Why would we build more? Which
That's a good line of thought. That's good logic.
Exactly. So, now this was resisted by the United Church, the Anglican Church, and the missionary oblates of Mary Immaculate, who believed that the solution to the system's failure was not restricting it, but intensifying it. So they thought they just weren't being tough enough and stuff, that there was things that they could do to intensify the training, so to speak.
Which is insane.
Right. So, now, between 1945 and 1955, the idea of assimilating the children began to shift and focus more on trying to integrate them into public schools, which they should have tried to do to start with. They wanted to allow those kids to go to the schools. The parents wanted them to go to, like, the white schools or whatever. There's nothing wrong with that, but they should have still been able to have their own beliefs, religions, whatever, their own practices, and still been able to go to school to get the education.
Yep.
But, of course. So, during this time, the amount of children that attended schools run by Indian Affairs grew from 9,532 to 17,947. However, during this shift in policy, the removal of children by state officials continued throughout the most of the 60s and 70s. Now, most of these removals came as a result of the 1951 addition of Section 88 of the Indian Act, which allowed provincial laws to the Indigenous people who were living on reserves in the instance that federal laws were not already in place. So basically, they could have their own, like, CPS go out, so to speak, now, because they were under, provincial laws instead of just having, their own laws, which what they're supposed to have on their reservations. Now, this change included the monitoring of child welfare, which I don't see anything wrong with it in the aspect of it, because those children could be abused just like anybody else's children could be abused. And yeah, somebody should be looking out for them. But there were no requirements for any specialized training in regards to the traditions and lifestyles of the Indigenous people, which led them to be judged based on Euro-Canadian values. Now, one example of this was determined that traditional diets, which this is what they normally ate, was like game, fish, and berries, which I'm sure a lot of people like that would have ate back then. They hunted, they fished, and then they gathered berries.
Even nowadays, we don't eat like too differently.
Well, not necessarily, right.
We still eat game, we eat meat.
Right.
Some people hunt for their own food.
Well, exactly.
We still forage for berries, fruits, stuff like that.
Exactly. Now, this was deemed insufficient, and that was enough to remove a child from a home because of what they were feeding them. They were saying that they weren't feeding them properly.
Now, to an extent, I can understand that. Like, if they weren't getting enough, like, nutrients of the right kinds.
But there's things that could be done. They wouldn't have to take them from homes.
Yeah.
They could teach them if that was the case and say there's things that we can do to help your child's health.
Yeah,
Most people would probably be okay with it. That's what's even worse about it is a lot of these Indians and American Indians and from, other countries as well, they weren't necessarily opposed to listening to anything the white people said. It was just how it was presented to them. It was pretty much just shoved down their throat. It's like, this is what you're going to do. That's when they'd bow up, and most people would.
Yeah.
But, anyway. So, these children were then often placed in state-run child welfare facilities that were often operated in former-run residential schools. Now, some then were also fostered or placed up for adoption by the predominantly non-Indigenous families throughout U.S. and Canada. So, they were basically being sent to live with white families, and they were being adopted by white families at this point. And it's estimated that approximately 11,000 children were adopted between 1960 and 1990. However, this may actually be as high as 20,000 or more. Now, that's sad because a lot of these kids, they probably weren't even being abused in the big scheme.
I love how I love how it's worded as adopted.
Yeah.
When in reality, it's just kidnapping.
It pretty much is. It is. They just took these people's kids and then just did what they wanted to. And then they had these laws, and they wouldn't understand these laws at that time because, I mean, they weren't really, out in, they were on reservations and things, so they didn't understand a lot of stuff. It's just, they took advantage of them. So, sometime in 1969, the Department of Indian Affairs took over sole control of the school system. The peak of the schools happened during the 1930s, where there were roughly 80 schools and more than 17,000 children enrolled. And like I said before, there was like 150,000 kids that were supposed to went through these schools over the course of their existence, which that's a lot of kids, considering it's only the indigenous tribes. It's not like, and their numbers are going to be smaller.
Yeah.
Due to a lot of bad things that have happened, but, still. So, as expected, there were some parents and families of the children that resisted the school system throughout its entire history, which is absolutely understandable.
Yes.
Now, this led to children being kept from going to schools, people trying to keep their kids from going to the schools, and basically that would lead them to like hiding them on the reservations and things so they couldn't find them and things like that, or acting like they didn't have kids and things, which I can understand because they were just coming in and taking their kids.
Yeah.
I mean, what would you do, Which led to, of course, officials being sent out to just round the kids up. And they would. They'd just go out on the reservations and just start rounding these kids up like they're cattle or something. And parents also were known to regularly advocate for the increased funding to the schools, and to which would include help include more centrally located day schools to improve access to their children, which, of course, I mean, why would you want them to come in and take your kid and go 150 miles away back then when they didn't have like a car? They couldn't just hop in and go.
Yeah.
So they wanted them to move the schools closer, which, duh. As well as they made regular requests for improvements for the quality of education the children were receiving, as well as better food and clothing to be given to the children at the school. But if a parent made a demand for answers in regards to claims of abuse that were inflicted on the children, their questions were disregarded as a ploy made by the parents to keep their children at home. So they would say, hey, my kid says he's being abused. They'd say, oh, you're just wanting your kid at home. There's nothing happening, even though it was.
Yeah.
Which makes perfect sense. Like I said before, any normal parent would be very upset if their children were just simply ripped from them and then sent to a facility where they were treated poorly, and we just already said it, in every way you can imagine. So it stands to reason that, of course, they'd want their kids at home, but that don't mean that was the sole reason behind it. It was also because of the way they were being treated. They actually had fair accusations.
Also, from a modern standpoint, who cares if they just want them at home?
Well, yeah. I mean,
like nowadays, there's such a thing as homeschooling.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Most parents do want their children to live at home.
Like, if something like this happened nowadays, it would be over in an instant.
Yeah, I mean,
it would not
nuts.
stand.
It's sad and it's nuts.
At least that's here in the U.S.
Well, we would hope so, yes. We would hope nothing like that would ever happen, where they would just literally come in and just rip people's children away from them and just carry them off, and wasn't nothing you could do.
Then again, speaking from personal experience here, CPS is kind of a issue sometimes.
It can be.
It's a good thing in most cases.
In some cases, it can be. In some cases, I've also heard of kids dying.
Heavily abused, yeah.
And they were investigating them the whole time, and the kids having injuries, and there's literally nothing ever being done. So there you go. So we're going to talk a little bit about the conditions that the children were made to be in and different things. So as stated earlier, the children were abused in a multitude of ways, which included physical types of abuse, like we said before, every type of physical abuse you can think of, beatings, SA, everything. They were also given harsh discipline that would not have been tolerated in any other Canadian school system. And it was believed that corporal punishment, which is basically just essentially a punishment that could cause physical pain, like paddling a kid or smacking them or anything. I mean, anything that causes pain.
Or whipping, most likely.
You could. Whip them, cane them. I mean, you could do literally anything that, would be considered that.
I know that was a big punishment for children in those types of schools.
Right. Now, it was done because it was said it was the only way to save the souls of the children. And it was also used as a means to punish children that ran away and to deter them from ever trying again to escape. So if they ran off, they would just beat the heck out of them when they came back, God knows how badly. And there you go.
I wouldn't doubt in some cases to death.
Yeah, they may have. They may have, because there's a lot of kids that's been buried in unmarked graves that they still don't know who they are. So the children were malnourished, exposed to severe overcrowding, poor sanitation, inadequate heating, and a lack of basic medical care, which then led to high rates of influenza and tuberculosis. In one school alone, the death rate reached 69% of children who died from either tuberculosis or influenza
Jesus.
because they weren't given any medical care. Also, federal policies that tied funding directly to enrollment numbers led to the overcrowding, as well as many children that were sick to be admitted. So they didn't care. If they already even knew they were sick, they would let them in. They wanted as many kids as they could get because that's how they got their money. Which, of course, only led to more issues, even for the sick kids, because it not only led to the overcrowding, it also impacted their health further because there was poor ventilation, the water quality was poor sewage, everything. So even if they were just mildly sick, they may have went really downhill and possibly died from something that could have been easily preventable.
So, you know what I don't understand about situations exactly like this? They get money for more kids, right? The more kids they have, the more funding they get.
Supposed to. They get so much per year per child.
So instead of spending that money just on themselves, which you know they did, they just pocketed that money.
Probably a lot of it.
They could have kept this whole scheme running for much longer and have been much more profitable had they just spent a fraction of that money on actually improving the situation there.
I mean, in truth, they probably could have.
And they could have eventually ended up expanding.
Oh, yeah.
And getting more kids, which means more funding, creating more buildings, more
schools, right.
And got more funding, like I said, and just kept it going longer and
longer.
They
could have. I mean, they could have done a lot of things if they'd done it differently.
That would have been the smarter option. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not condoning what they did to the children.
No, but for the way they were trying to run it, it does look like they were running it in a way to grab as much cash as they could
as quick as possible
by cramming as many kids in there as they could. So yeah, I get what you're saying. It does look like they would do some things to keep it running as long as possible, just to keep that money coming in. As sickening as it is, if that's what they were doing it for, that's what they would do. Try to keep it going as long as possible. Now, most schools were terribly underfunded, which led to then the forced labor of the children as a means to maintain the buildings. Now, this was presented as the children being trained for artisanal skills, which would be essentially someone who makes something at least partially by hand. And it was also that by forcing the children to do all the work around the schools, this would allow the government to drastically cut costs and allow the schools to become financially independent so that the government wouldn't even have to give them any money. So students were made to raise or grow and then prepare almost all of the food that they ate, as well as maintaining all the buildings. And then they were also even made to repair the little bit of clothing that they were given by the school. If they got like a rip, they had to repair it. Now, I can understand some of this to a point. Now, some of these skills in the basic gist are not necessarily bad skills to have. It's just the way they went about it. Not learning how to patch a hole in your jeans or something, not necessarily a bad skill to have. Learning how to grow some food, not necessarily a bad skill to have. I mean, just basic survival skills. But you know what I'm saying? This was just taken way too far. Now, in later memoirs that were written by former students, they discussed how they were subjected to abuse by not only staff members, but also older students were very aggressive and doing things too. Now, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission lists 3 reasons behind the federal government's decision to establish the residential schools. Number 1, it was to provide Aboriginal people with skills to participate in a market-based economy, so like a normal economy that we have now, or most people are used to. It was also, number 2, to further political assimilation in the hopes that educated students would give up their status and not return to the reserves or family. So they would give up their status as being a part of that tribe, the First Nations, and all that. 3, schools were engines of cultural and spiritual change where savages were to emerge as Christian white men. I know. I mean, I know. It's so sickening and it's so sad that was literally written down on a piece of paper, pretty much, that's what they were doing. Now, Ansel McCrae, who was the commissioner with the Indians Affairs, was quoted as saying, "It is unlikely that any tribe or tribes would give trouble of a serious nature to the government whose members had children completely under government control." which is an absolutely disgusting thing to say. And it's even worse that this is a guy who's supposed to be looking after the Indian affairs. And basically, they're just looking for a way to control these people more and more and more because they're saying, hey, if we got their kids under our control, they're all going to fall in line.
Which, that's fair.
It's fair,
That's
but
a smart strategy. It's only going to last for a certain amount of time, but
it's just...
It's a strategy that existed.
Yeah. So, as you can imagine, funding for the schools was repeatedly cut. So, in 1937, for example, the amount that was granted at these schools was $180 a year for each child. Now, that sounds like a lot of money, but other schools, like the Manitoba School for the Deaf, received $642 per child. The Manitoba School for Boys received $550 per child, and the average amount per child in a well-run school ranged between $313 to $541. So they weren't even getting even half of what the lowest was, really, just about half of it, roughly. So government officials also believed that since most staff members belonged to religious orders that had vows of poverty, pay was not important, which led to poor pay for the staff and led to difficulties in recruiting and maintaining staff, which I wonder why. They're not paying them anything, so yeah. Now, many families and parents of the children would regularly travel to these schools, often even camping outside the facilities as a way to be closer to their children. Now, this led the Indian Commissioner Hayter Reed to argue that the schools should be moved even further away from the reservation so that it would make it even more difficult for the parents to visit, and that cut them off even more. Because they'd be like, it's too far, we can't go, and then they would lose even more contact with any of their families. He also disgustingly objected to the children even being allowed to go home during school breaks or holidays, as he thought it would interrupt the assimilation. So he never wanted them to leave.
Yeah.
He wanted them to stay there all the time. He didn't want their parents to ever come see them. He literally wanted to cut them off from everybody that they knew in their entire lives.
Which, again, makes sense. If you're abusing someone, you typically don't want them to be near anyone else.
Now, visitation for parents was described as much like somebody going to a prison visiting, and it was very strictly controlled. In some schools, it was just completely denied. You couldn't visit your children at all. Others required parents to visit in the presence of school officials, and they were made to communicate in English only, which meant if the parents couldn't speak English, they weren't allowed to speak to their children at all. They weren't allowed to say a word to them, because they would not allow them to speak in their own native tongues.
Again, that makes sense if you're wanting to basically turn these people into
They did. They wanted them
English
to completely
speakers.
forget how to speak their native tongues.
If they just wanted to erase their native personalities.
They did.
Yeah.
They wanted to erase everything.
Sickening, but
that's what they wanted to do. Now, families faced other obstacles in trying to visit their children due to something called the pass system, which was a system that was introduced by Hayter Reed without even the legislative authority to do so. Now, this system restricted and closely monitored the movement of individuals off the reserves, and it was set up in a way from preventing anyone from even leaving the reserves unless they were given a permit or a pass, which was very difficult to get. So if you didn't have this permit or this pass, you weren't even supposed to leave the reserves. So now, children were also taught in a way that was very different than they were accustomed to. Now, they would normally be taught in a style that included like encouraging them to, try things and things like that. Also, like gameplay-based play, storytelling, and like learning these ceremonies and all this stuff. Now they were expected to learn under the European approach, which was based on the look, listen, and learn model. And they weren't used to that, of course. Now, the impact from the children being isolated from their families, sometimes for up to 10 months at a time, and even in some cases going on for years without having any contact, of course, just led to further disconnect. The children were discouraged or completely prohibited from speaking their native tongue in the hopes that English or French would replace the former language, and they would completely forget how to speak the native tongue at all. Some schools would resort to physical violence against children who spoke their own languages, or if they practiced any non-Christian faiths. Most schools stated the goal of providing students with the vocational and social skills they would need in order to obtain employment and to integrate into society. However, these goals, as you can imagine, were poorly and inconsistently achieved, and many of those that graduated from these schools were unable to gain employment due to poor training and education. So it didn't do anything for them. Returning home was also hard, as many could no longer communicate with their families. They had literally had, some of them were very young when they were taken, and they didn't remember how to speak the language anymore. A father of one student was quoted as saying his child could not read, speak, or write English, and nearly all of the child's time had been devoted to herding and caring for cattle instead of learning a trade or being otherwise educated. So, I mean, Now, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the experimentation that was done on these kids. So, it was revealed in the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that many students were included in several scientific research experiments without their parents' knowledge or their knowledge, and without the consent of them or their parents. So these included nutritional experiments, which involved the intentional malnourishment of the children, vaccine trials for the BCG vaccine, which is a vaccine that was going to be used for tuberculosis, as well as studies on extrasensory perception, vitamin D supplement things, ombiocide, isoniazid experiments, hemoglobin experiments, bedwetting, and dermatoglyphics, which is like the studying of their fingerprints and stuff, just weird stuff. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about these nutritional studies. Now, the goal of the initial study was supposedly to investigate the sustenance patterns and nutritional states of Indigenous people by giving physical exams, blood tests, and x-rays. However, recent food history research indicated that the malnourishment of the children was done intentionally, which was evidenced by the Canadian government's awareness of malnutrition in the children admitted to the residential school at the beginning of the experiments. But they didn't do anything to help them. Well, I'll take that back. They did some, they didn't others, so they could see what would happen. Other experiments included withholding milk rations to less than half the amount that was recommended for a child to have a day. For 2 years, some children were given vitamins, iodine, and iron supplements, while others were not. Some of the children also had a vitamin B deficiency, which the schools were fully aware of. However, they didn't do anything like providing supplements to help, and they did this in a means to gain a baseline against the results that were being gathered from other schools. In these experiments, efforts were made to control as many factors as possible, even if research subjects were harmed. Another example of this would be that dental care was denied to the children in an effort to observe the state of the children's teeth and the impact of gingivitis on children suffering from malnutrition. You know what I'm saying? It's just,
Yeah.
It's
just a whole bunch of sickening crap.
And it don't get any better. So
it never does.
the BCG studies, the Bacillus calmette-guerin vaccine, better known as the BCG vaccine, is a vaccine used against tuberculosis mainly. It's got some other uses, but that's what it's mainly used. So First Nation infants were used in Saskatchewan trials in the 1930s and 40s. And, oh my gosh, that they were trying these on infants before they even knew what it would do in the 1930s and 40s. They were taking babies, newborn babies, and let's see what happens. So it was believed that vaccines were cheaper than improving the schools or the reserves. So it'd just be easier just to give them vaccines than it would be to actually try to help them. And anyway, the vaccines were even considered controversial at the time, as a German experiment in 1930 led to the deaths of 31 children after they were given a contaminated strain. And close to 400,000 children were vaccinated. Trials were also conducted in Montreal, but it was unclear of how harmful the vaccine was, so we don't know if it helped any or if it hurt them or what. We don't really know. The United States and Britain even chose not to use the vaccine because of the fears that it was unstable. So now Canada didn't sound like they were really using it on the white people. They were just using it on the Indigenous people.
Yeah.
But I can't say anything. The U.S. would have probably did it on American Indians had they only thought of it. So,
I don't doubt it.
There you go. I mean, it doesn't mean, one country's better. That's the way it was. It's just disgusting, but... So, adverse effects of the vaccine can include, like, scarring of the injection site and development of these keloids, which are like these large raised scars. It should be given intradermally, which means it's supposed to be injected into the skin or between the layers of the skin. If it's given subcutaneously, which would be like right underneath the skin, it can lead to a local infection that can then spread to the lymph nodes, which can cause the production of pus, which then has to be aspirated with a needle or sometimes even be surgically removed. So, good grief, right? It can also sometimes cause abscesses in the breast and the gluteal area. However, that's not common, but still.
It happens.
Right. Now, other studies included the testing of antibiotics that were used to help treat tuberculosis, and these drugs had side effects like peripheral neuropathy, which is essentially a disease that attacks the nerves. It had nausea and vomiting. You may also get aplastic anemia, which is a serious condition in which the body fails to make enough blood cells, as well as several other things. Hypersensitive reactions, these could lead to like a rash, and gynecomastia, which is the largening of one breast by a non-cancerous growth, can also occur. Headache, poor concentration, weight gain, poor memory, insomnia, and depression have also been associated with use of this drug. And these were all used and tested on these kids while they were there without their knowledge and without their parents' knowledge. So, I don't know. Now, like I said, if they actually were attempting in some way to improve lives in a way that they were offering these children a way to become integrated, if they so chose to, into like more like off the reserves, basically. Wanted to maybe go to college, maybe wanted to get a job, maybe wanted to live in a city. There's nothing wrong with that. And if they wanted to, that was what they were trying to do, fine. But that does not sound like this is what that was at all.
No, it does not. This is possibly the worst way they could have gone about integrating them into...
They weren't trying to integrate them. They were just trying to make them Christian white men, is even what they said, basically.
Yeah.
Now, granted, women too, but you know what I'm saying. They said men, but oh my gosh. Now, there's nothing wrong with Christian white men or whatever, if that's what you are. But
trying to override an entire people's cultural identity by force is a sickening thing to do.
Exactly. I don't have any problem with anybody, you know, they can be whatever you are. If that's what you're, you know, you believe in and everything, fine. You can even talk about it with other people, but it never should, you know, be shoved down somebody's throat, and it definitely shouldn't have somebody ripping somebody's kids away from them and just saying, hey, you're going to be what we want you to be. Don't matter what anybody else says. But anyway, we do hope you enjoyed that episode. I mean, I know as much as you could because it's not a very happy one. Unfortunately, none of these are. We're going to continue on with one more episode. You're probably going to want to hear this one because it's going to be about the CIA's MK Ultra. And then we're going to be starting on some creepypastas, some different ones. I think we're going to do some Slender Man, the Russian sleep experiment. Back in my territory,
finally.
Yeah, we're going to go over some of those. So if there's any you want to hear about or hear some of the history of, hear a little bit more about, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. Don't forget to stay disturbed.